talk with you. And some of you who I know are very detail oriented and extra perceptive may see that we've switched the title just a little bit to Finding the Right Fit. Because before we said finding the perfect fit, and there really is no such thing as a perfect fit. And I'm really going to point out a lot of the strengths and challenges of each of the sectors so that you all can look at them honestly and match them up with who you are and what your needs are, and think through maybe whether one versus another might be more of a right fit for you. You may discover very quickly that I'm a person who loves a sense of humor. And so I am going to use a fair amount of humor throughout this presentation. And I just want to say to you that it is in no way meant to be disparaging towards any sector. Every sector has its idiosyncrasies. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself and some of my experiences so you know what I'm speaking about. But since I've worked in all the sectors, I have tremendous respect for each one, but I also see some of the pros and cons. So I like to use humor to highlight some of the funnier aspects of the sectors. We have about 45 minutes or so. I want to leave room for questions. And because I can't see all of you, don't hesitate to use the chat feature at any point in time. You're not going to throw me off. I prefer interactive. I wish it could be more so, but just because of the sake of time, I want to try to cover the material. So having said that, I want to launch in and just tell you a teeny bit about myself. As I mentioned, I have worked in all three sectors, nonprofit, private, and public, and I'll share a little bit more about that as we go on. I've also had two of my own entrepreneurial businesses, so I know what it's like to sort of run the show from everything, you know, from filing the papers to setting the mission and vision of an organization. Even more importantly, because that's what's brought me here, I actually took a creative approach to part of my career, and I decided to become an executive on loan, where I would donate my expertise to organizations that I handpicked. And I was really fortunate that one of the organizations I came across was Dog Tag. And I've been involved with Dog Tag for the past 6 years, spending much of that time donating what I know to help the organization in all the ways that Frances was kind enough to highlight. But I'm also very proud that that time volunteering my expertise has turned into a position with the organization where I'm working with their alumni and their fellows in the fellowship program. And this is something that I'll talk a little bit more towards the end of the presentation, but I'm a big believer in exploring things in a creative way to figure out what your fit is. Because if I hadn't done that, I truly wouldn't be doing one of the things that I consider to be one of the most joyful things that I've ever done in my career. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. To start off though, as I mentioned, I do like to use humor. And as I also said, there are idiosyncrasies that I'm sure many of you know about each of the sectors. So to kick us off, we're going to do like a little true and false. And I know it's hard for everybody to participate, but one of the idiosyncrasies that often comes up, say with the public sector or the government sector, is that it's nothing but full of bureaucratic incompetence. And I have to say that having worked at the National Cancer Institute on the campus of the National Institute of Health, I have seen and experienced some of the most talented experts in their field that are so inspirational, that absolutely put this cartoon to shame. I will also say, though, honestly, that I have, being in the communications field, I have spent weeks and weeks trying to convince decision makers what the right color blue would be for a particular brochure before we could reprint it. And so I'm going to be really honest with you all. I have seen both sides of it, both one inspirational, one very frustrating. But as I said, there is no perfect fit. So it's important to understand these things about each sector so that you can decide for yourself what are my stressor points, what are my pressure points, what really gets under my skin, what really motivates me. And so I would say cartoon is funny, at least to me it is, but not entirely accurate, as you can imagine. Looking at the private sector, true or false, It looks like, these two business people are getting ready to go into the lion's den, if you will, for their supposed stockholder meeting. I too have worked in the private sector and worked with a lot of Fortune 100 to 500 companies as a consultant. And I can honestly say that there is no doubt that depending upon the size of the company with whom you're working, the pace can vary greatly. And if you like a fast pace, it can be very motivational, very inspiring. But if you don't, it can cause you to shut down. So it's very important to know that. Also, there is this perception that you go into a meeting, you're asked to present, you're going into a lion's den, so to speak, and you have to fight for yourself. Occasionally, this is true as well. I remember working for one organization where if you left before 5 o'clock, even if you did everything on your to-do list, you were judged harshly. And it actually came up in my performance review because work-life balance was very important to me. And I liked to get home in time to take care of family matters. And I would often bring home a thick file of work, and I would do it after I had taken care of some of the personal things I needed to take care of. I never missed a deadline. And yet, because of the culture at this one particular place, I was looked at differently because it was important for me to leave at 5 o'clock, even though I always got my work done. Long story short, I didn't stay there for particularly long because I decided that it wasn't the right vibe for me. Good to know that. But my reviews were always excellent. I just made a decision for myself that I didn't like the feel of it, but I absolutely loved the teamwork and the ambition. And I also didn't mind the higher salary there than other places. And finally, moving on to the nonprofit area. Nonprofits are often viewed as kind of crunchy granola, maybe hippie, maybe kumbaya, maybe very soft-hearted, not business-oriented. And I can absolutely say that I've experienced nonprofits that are like that, and the people who work there are very happy. My whole professional outlook was informed by my time at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in Bethesda, Maryland. It ran itself like a corporation. And I was fascinated by this because it was working on the cutting edge of finding a cure for one of the worst genetic diseases that affected so many children. And in fact, during our time there, they identified the gene that caused cystic fibrosis. And that was because of the business attitude they had, where the money that they raised was going to go to research, because the only way to truly help people with this disease was to find the gene and then be able to come up with the medications to stop it. What I learned from that experience was there was a tremendous amount of heart. There was a tremendous amount of people who were driven by the mission. But if it wasn't for a very aggressive mentality that you might find more often in the private sector, there wouldn't have been those great strides made. And people who have cystic fibrosis are now living decades longer than they could have ever imagined because of that mentality. And that changed my whole attitude about the nonprofit sector, as well as what you can learn from each of the sectors, which I'll talk about a little bit more. However, as I said earlier, one of the things that I would encourage all of you to ask yourself first is to know yourself best. Know your needs, your skills, and your interests. That's the most important driving force. And I'm sure you've done this already in many ways, so I won't go into great detail with this list, but obviously you have a field or an industry you're interested in or you'd like to shift into. You have to talk to yourself about what your career values, your life values are, as long as the work-life balance that I mentioned that I felt when I was working in the private sector. You have to be honest with yourself about what your skills are and your strengths and what functions you truly enjoy performing. And if there's something on your list that you'd like to do, but you don't believe that you can yet do it, then we're going to talk about a few things that you should think about, such as maybe you need additional education. Maybe you need to get a temporary experience so you can build up some of your expertise and show it on your resume. Maybe you should consider volunteering, things like that. You also need to know what truly makes you happy. For some people, it's a really fat paycheck, and there's nothing wrong with that. For other people, you have to really care about what you're doing, or maybe it's a combination, or maybe it's something else altogether. For a lot of people, having a really clear plan laid out for you is critical. So the clarity of your job and having a sense from the organization that if you want to ascend the ladder, this is your path for promotion. These are the opportunities we use to support you. That is incredibly important. And obviously the atmosphere. Is it fast-paced, slow-paced? What's important to you? Do you like to be in a smaller shop? Do you like to do you feel more comfortable if you can just put your head down and do your job? So it's not going to bother you if there's lots of layers in the organization. Do you like to be part of the decision making? Does it upset you if there's a lot of top-down decision making and you're not really sure why that decision was made? Very important things for you to ask yourself. I also want to just take a second to emphasize why answering these questions is so incredibly important. There's been a lot of national research done about what people say gives them their highest sense of job satisfaction. And I just want to share with you the top 5 things. It doesn't mean that there aren't more, but I'm just sharing with you the top 5 things. Being successful at your job is number 1 at job satisfaction. Having clear expectations of what success looks like. So that is tied to your supervisor and your communication with your supervisor and how you're reviewed and what the expectations are and if they're clearly laid out. The third is how do you connect how well can you connect what you're doing with the wider purpose of the organization? So again, that goes to the leadership of the organization, your supervisors. How well do they make sure you understand that whether you're in fulfillment or inventory or communications or personnel, whatever it may be, how is that supporting the greater good of the organization or the greater goal of the organization? And 4 and 5 are linked. It's having scheduled personnel reviews and appropriate feedback and clear compensation and promotion plans. Those are the top 5 things that national surveys have documented for job satisfaction. And so again, it's just another way of saying why answering these questions is more important than anything, first and foremost, in this conversation we're having today. So with that, here's my little take on why it's important to understand each sector, whether or not you think I'm very well suited for the government, I'm very well suited for corporate America, or I really am mission driven and wanted to work in nonprofit. Understanding each one is important because for yourself, you have to understand the challenges and opportunities and the realities and the misperceptions. And it's not just because you want to find your right fit. It's because I'm a huge believer in if you understand the way the economy works in these different structures, you can pull ideas from any sector and apply it within your organization. That is what I learned first and foremost in one of my first jobs at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, that you could actually use corporate strategies in the nonprofit setting. It's ethical, it's moral, it's not illegal. It might have been groundbreaking and it might have raised some eyebrows at the time, but it helped us do what we did even better. And I can say to you to this day that every sector uses strategies from every other sector, and it can just make you a more talented, more educated, more insightful employee, no matter where you are. Also, I don't think I have to tell you that there are more and more partnerships out there, especially now in this pandemic. We see how all the sectors come together to try to make the world a bit of a kinder place for all of us. And if you're working in one of those organizations, if you're looking across the table at a partner who happens to be from a government agency and you're from a nonprofit, if you understand their world a little bit better, you might be able to maximize that opportunity more successfully for yourself, for your organization, and for the people that you serve. Also, last point, I believe it enhances your professional marketability. Looking at me as an example, I didn't know that I was interested in working in all the different sectors. The fact that I did got me to the place where I am today, talking to you, where because I know about them, but it also enables me to be an advisor to the people who come through the Dog Tag Fellowship Program, because each one has different needs, and I'm uniquely suited to be able to talk to any person about any sector because of my personal experience. I'm not saying or encouraging you to go for that as your ultimate job, but what I'm saying is that you will come across opportunities to engage in conversations, collaborations, partnerships with people from different sectors. Your understanding them is going to make you much more successful at what you do. So today, what we're going to do is cover these areas for each section. We're going to talk about structure and who's served, what the general sense of job security is like, the financial benefits and opportunities, environment, misperceptions, and then we're going to conclude with some resources that hopefully will be helpful to you depending upon your interest. So we're going to kick it off with the public sector, which I'm sure many of you know is also known as the government, and it's government and all publicly controlled and funded agencies that deliver public programs, goods, and services in a huge area, from everything from health and education and law enforcement and military and infrastructure, like building roads and building bridges and that kind of thing. The structure of the public sector ranges from local all the way to international. So a couple examples, which I'm sure many of you know, is the DC Public Library is a government organization, local. The Environmental Protection Agency, say the Mid-Atlantic region, is a regional structure, and the National Institutes of Health is a national level organization that also has ties to international, as does the Peace Corps. That's an international level organization. It's really important to, again, go back to what your needs and skills and interests are and learn about what does the structure size of these organizations mean for me? Is that going to provide challenges? Is it going to provide opportunities or frustrations? And so it's important to understand which one you're talking about. It's very different to work for the local public library than it is to work for a national library organization that might have, 250 employees. A very different tone, a very different culture. Just to take a minute, when we talk about who's served for the government, typically the vocabulary we use is really, really important. And with the government, the public is served, and you'll often see the word constituents. And it may sound silly for me to emphasize this, but this is why it's important. When I first worked in the nonprofit area, we talked about serving people, serving the public, or serving communities. If for a moment I referred to the people that I was serving when I worked in a national nonprofit as customers, my credibility would be gone. Nobody referred to people in the nonprofit space as customers. It was considered corporate, it was considered insensitive, it was considered not being thoughtful to the mission of the organization. I think we've come past that to a certain extent, but I will say this. I think it's pretty infrequent to hear the word customer used in government settings, possibly in different levels of government, especially if you're in procurement and contracting and that kind of thing. But most of the time when you work for a government agency, you talk about serving the constituents, or you talk about serving the public, the communities, or possibly other government agencies, because you're in partnerships together, or the mission of your government agency is to support other agencies depending upon structure and location and that kind of thing. So that's just 101 on government. I'm sure many of you know that already. But in terms of job security, I think it's fair to say, and again, these are generalities. This is not hard and fast for every government organization. There tends to have a higher level of job security because when you're hired, you go through a pretty strenuous hiring process of filling out specific forms that have to meet the criteria of the government. And when you're hired, you're brought in on a certain pay scale. And I'm sure many of you know the GS level pay scale, 1 through 15. The thing about that that's important, again, that many of you know, is that every single one of those pay scales from 1 to 15 has their own individual level of 10. And sometimes that understanding of how people are paid in this fashion through the GS level is very comforting, because they know in order to achieve a GS level 3 or 4, they have to go through these 10 stages, and then they have to achieve these levels in their reviews in order to get to the next pay scale. You can see it, you know what you have to achieve. Others might find it very frustrating because it does take time. They're often slower growth opportunities, and you have to hit those marks before you're able to achieve some of the things that you may want to achieve. The positive side is that government agencies often offer much stronger retirement plans and health benefits that have a certain level of security to them. So again, you can see why, if you loop back to those earlier questions, you should ask yourself about your own personal needs. Would this be a good fit for you? Because it has some of these, it has some of these advantages. I think the environment in the government, as you can see, I'm bringing in some of these cartoons that I find sometimes accurate and sometimes far from accurate. I think a lot of the time, unless you're working in possibly a military environment, possibly and most likely in a very high level within the government, other than those areas, and there could be others that I'm not thinking of right now, generally you have set work schedules and hours. But if you're at a higher level, White House level, for example, chances are you're going to have just an extraordinarily high number of hours. And I don't need to share with many of you that if you're in the military, all bets can be off sometimes, depending upon what is going on at the time. Another thing about the environment, because approvals to go through in the government, because it is funded by taxpayer dollars and there needs to be these checks and balances, that there can be slower decision making. And you can also feel, that example I gave you about how long is it going to take for us to decide on the color blue, you can often feel there's a lack of control. And because of the hierarchies that can exist, just the GS levels alone that we discussed, that level of having to go through numbers of positions or people to get things done, that can be frustrating. We talked already about some of the misperceptions, that if there's this level of bureaucracy, these layers, there must be tremendous inefficiencies. And because you have to go through so many levels to get hired, it's also true that it takes a fair amount to let somebody go in the public sector. And sometimes this turns into these misperceptions of inefficiencies in a workforce that's unproductive or less skilled. And again, from my experience at the National Cancer Institute, I can say that I was really fortunate that I worked with bosses that bent over backwards to give me opportunities that were creative and unique so that they could tap into the skills that I brought to the table. And at the same time, I had opportunities to work in other areas that I never thought that I'd have the possibility of doing, and that I was motivated and inspired by people all the time. Yes, I had moments of frustration about how long it took to push answers through or inefficiencies, but I still come down on the side of pros and cons everywhere, not a perfect fit, a right fit. And I'm not sugarcoating it. If we have time, happy to talk about examples of when things have just been really, really frustrating and that change has to come. But generally speaking, I have had a really nice mix, no matter what the sector, including the public sector. So moving on to the private sector, also known as the corporate, the business, or the for-profit sector. Pretty simple. It's businesses or the private sector, businesses run by individuals and companies for profit. They are not controlled by the government, though. They can take on lots of different shapes and sizes, but not run by the government, held by individuals or companies We're not going to get into a ton of the details about the different structures for corporations. If there are follow-up questions on that, I'm more than happy to take them. But who is served here? We talked about customers. Obviously, this is a vocabulary word that's used frequently among the private sector. Obviously, you can support other businesses. You may have to support investors if you are going to be a publicly traded company and you want to be on the stock market. You may need to find extraordinarily wealthy individuals or firms that are going to support what it is that you want to launch. So they may be a super important audience that you want to serve, need to serve. And there are board members for companies. And you have to keep that in mind too. Each one requires a different skill set. Sometimes you're in a position where you're asked to work with all. And so again, going back to the original slide, you need to know if you like the diversity in the types of people that you work with, or if you prefer to have certain kinds of communications that makes you a more productive, a more successful employee for that business. As far as structure goes, same as any of the others, ranges from small to global. And the size of size of a private company, just like government, is going to influence the resources you have and the opportunities you have, and also the pace with which that organization moves. You know, Nike, for example, is a international company. Take CVS, the drugstore, that's a national organization. Safeway, the grocery store, is actually regional. And there's this private business known as Made in DC, right in Georgetown, that's this little small business. I don't think I need to go into the details of why the sizes might make it a much different place for you to work. And neither is right or wrong. It's just important to know about yourself. And then when you're interviewing, ask questions about the pace and the structure and the hierarchy and how that makes you feel. Would that be a happy place for you? Oftentimes, again, generally speaking, depending upon the size of the business, you often can meet a higher pay scale earlier on in the organization. I will say on the flip side, there can be a range of retirement plans and health benefits depending upon who you're working for in the private sector, predominantly because of size and the revenue that they generate. And I think it's pretty fair to say with the pace, there tends to be a lot more opportunities for personal and professional advancement in the private sector. So something that you should keep in mind as well. It is true that the environment can be more demanding and more fast. There can be more instability, as this cartoon suggests, but again, a lot of that is tied to the almighty dollar, whether or not you have enough resources to support the infrastructure. And it also is tied to how many layers there are of decision makers within the company. When it's pretty fast top down, I think the pace is going to start to move pretty fast. And you know, I think it's also fair to say that probably in most private sector companies that you're going to come across more up-to-date resources because of the pace, because of probably being much more product-driven, possibly even though they're service-driven. You know, you just gotta keep up with what's going on, or else it's going to be much harder to succeed as a business. We'll talk about the opposite in the nonprofit world, which again, I'm sure many of you know. Can't find my mouse. There it is. So misperceptions about the private sector. The biggest one is that companies are only profit driven. And in fact, yes, of course they are, and they have to be profit driven, but there's a tremendous increase in companies that are following what's known as corporate social responsibility practices. I've worked a lot on this area with companies where they align themselves with issues or causes to truly help those causes. But research has shown that yes, aligning yourself with a cause in an appropriate way, in the right way, can actually improve your bottom line as a business. It can also help the morale and integration of your employees. And this has been exploding in Fortune 100 to 500 companies and beyond. Also, there are companies who sell items that do good in the world. So they're mission driven. I remember one impressive organization where they created a soccer ball that when you kicked it, it generated energy that could bring electricity to impoverished villages in the developing world. They sold the soccer ball to other organizations that distributed them. So they were making a profit, but they were doing good out in the world. So there are for-profit businesses that are structured as for-profit, but they are mission-driven. The other misperception is that they're cutthroat, and I think this cartoon kind of says it all. And of course, it really depends on who you might have the misfortune of working with. Again, very important to ask the right questions and get a sense of who might be your supervisor. If you have the chance to spend time with other people in that area or department to get to see if you, I know it's hard, but to see if you can get an honest answer about how it feels to work there. All incredibly important. And sometimes it doesn't come down to the sector, it comes down to the personality. Sometimes it comes from the culture that's been created. Excuse me. And there can be culture shifts, but try to learn about that as much as possible before you enter into it. The final sector, let me see how we're doing on time, not terrible, is the nonprofit sector. You might often hear them referred to as NGOs or non-governmental organizations. It's the same thing. And nonprofits provide a service or a product without a financial return or profit because the funds go directly back into the organization to support its programs. And nonprofits rely on either donations or on membership fees to stay afloat, or grants in the form of financial support. And there's a range of services from charitable, social welfare, justice, religious, educational, health, and well-being. And we're going to talk a little bit about them in the next sections. So nonprofits can get a little confusing at times, and I hope I don't confuse you. So if you have questions, please write them down and we'll go through them. But there's one type of nonprofit that serve communities or the public through a charitable organization. And examples of those would be the American Heart Association, raising money to try to address heart disease, or like a Martha's Table that serves food, or an artistic foundation, or Doctors Without Borders. And these, by the way, are also examples of organizations that are national, local, regional, and Doctors Without Borders is an international organization. Another form of nonprofit is a foundation that support its sister nonprofits through grant making. An example of those would be the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that's been in the news a lot lately. Nonprofits also serve members, and this is through the structure of what's called professional associations. And there's a wide range of professional associations, and there happens to be a ton of them in Alexandria, Virginia. And it ranges from things like the American Physical Therapy Association to the Council of Social Work Education to the National Association of Tax Accountants. And they have a certain kind of nonprofit status because they're membership organizations that support accountants or social workers or physical therapists, and they pay dues. And in return, they get networking opportunities and educational opportunities to further their skill set and that kind of thing. The other very important community that is served, if you will, are board of directors, because board of directors are the governing body of nonprofits. They have the responsibility to look at the financial, legal, ethical, and performance issues around the nonprofit. And so if any of you have worked in nonprofits, you often might get a sense of a frenzy when a board meeting is coming up and you have to pull together presentations and performance indicators at how well the organization is doing, because you do have to answer to your board of directors. I did talk about, again, like all the others, there's all kinds of, the structure goes from local to global. And this is an area where size matters significantly. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get to misperceptions. It is also very true that salaries and benefits vary widely. You can have a nonprofit that has a budget of $50,000 a year. You need to make sure you know that you search out what is that nonprofit's annual budget. If it's $50,000 a year for a staff of 5, you ain't going to be making $50,000 if that's your financial goal. If your goal is to go bigger, then look at larger nonprofits that bring in $1 million plus, and look at the number of staff that work there, and then do the math. Obviously, everybody's not making the same thing, but it's going to give you an idea of whether it's realistic to make your financial goals. Obviously, your position also matters about the financial benefits and opportunities, and the location. Rural, local nonprofits, it's going to be more challenging to hit certain financial benchmarks for yourself. That doesn't mean that they're not worthy organizations to work for or support, but that's just the reality of the situation. And the other thing that's really important to know, especially if it's a smaller organization, is that oftentimes you're going to be asked to wear many hats. You might love that because it gives you a chance to stretch and learn new things and grow and maybe even take on more. But if you like really crisp, clear clarity in what it is that you're doing, then an organization like a nonprofit of a certain size that demands this is going to make you absolutely miserable. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the environment. They do tend to attract very committed, passionate individuals who are motivated by the cause. There is often a positive work-life balance, but you have to be very clear based on your function, how that's going to affect your work-life balance. For example, if you're in fundraising and you're in charge of events can happen on the weekends or during the evening, and that might really mess up things that you have to deal with in your family life. And so you need to understand that. But they also can be very flexible with hours and schedules, because if you do work an entire weekend, they might say, take Monday and Tuesday off, because they can do that. It's less rigid that way than many government agencies are. And if, again, because you might need to work with many different audiences, the people who send in the money, the volunteers who are helping you with your events, board members, or partners that are also in the business community that are giving you funding or some sort of support, you might really love having that range of people that you work with. And again, a very important question to ask yourself. And you may not need to work with all those people depending upon your function within that organization, but you need to be clear how that translates for you. Again, depending upon the size, nonprofits can be understaffed and employees can be stretched. We talked about the limited budgets. The positive side of that is oftentimes that requires creativity and prioritization. And if that's your jam, then you could be really happy, even if it's not the wealthiest nonprofit. And this is very true. Depending upon the size, there can be much fewer resources, and you have to stretch. And technologies can be outdated, and that can be frustrating. And if that's important to you, you need to ask these questions before you enter into that environment in the interview process. There tend to be much fewer layers in nonprofits. They tend to be much more democratic and consensus oriented. That can be frustrating to some people. They don't necessarily want to be asked all the time, what do you think? Make your voice heard. That might make you uncomfortable, but they do tend to go that way more than the other sectors do. And a lot of times you're asked to do on-the-job training. I love this cartoon. I've experienced this myself. But they might say, guess what you're doing now? And you say, I don't know how to do that. And they say, you're going to have to learn it today. And again, if that causes you stress, important to know that that's a possibility depending upon the culture of the organization. Again, misperceptions typically in the nonprofit world is that there's never enough money. Again, depending upon the size, there can be a boatload of money. So do your research. Smaller, of course, there are going to be limited financial opportunities. Bigger, there are some massive nonprofits out there. So you can't make a judgment across the board. Oftentimes people think that if an organization is mission driven, that means the people there lack drive. And I can say that is unequivocally not true across the board. That a lot of times there are people very passionate about the cause because they have been affected by whatever the cause is. And that's why they have been motivated to work in that area. So they are incredibly driven and are willing to go to the ends of the earth to make things happen. And the fact that they're not business-like, the one example that I gave you, I can tell you based on my consulting work that more and more nonprofits are using a lot of strategies from the corporate world successfully and expect that of their employees too. So if you like that, ask the question about the culture of the nonprofit where you're interviewing. So we have just a few more slides, and I want to talk to you about some resource ideas to help you investigate any of the sectors. But I also want to stop for a minute, and if anybody has any questions about what we've covered so far, please don't hesitate to punch something in the chat and we can talk about it. And if I don't see anything, but you think of something, hopefully we'll have some time at the end because we're doing great as far as time goes. I just wanted to share with you, a couple of things that many of you probably already know, but a few you may not. If you're not sure what sector, or let's say you are sure what sector, talk to your friends and families and colleagues about their experiences if they're working in an arena that's of interest to you. Obviously, you know about networking events and job search websites. I don't need to go into that, or social media, where you can find, chat rooms and other ways of people structure your areas of interest. Don't underestimate Google. It may sound silly, but if you literally search careers in whatever area, I happen to put advertising here in quotes, you're going to get so much information that it might be a rabbit hole, but it is one way to start getting more thoughtful suggestions about honing your search. Obviously, each industry has professional publications. Some are free, some are not. Obviously, I'm a big believer in trying to find the free resources. For the government, for example, there is this Occupational Outlook Handbook, and I've given you the link. If you type in the functional area or the field, you can start getting ideas about different areas and how they're structured and that kind of thing. For the nonprofit sector, if you're interested in associations, there's the professional associate. There's so many professional association websites. So again, if you type in the Association of Nurses, you can learn a whole lot about the different opportunities in that world. And I do need to say that associations tend to be larger and have a lot bigger budgets and possibly more job opportunities than some of the smaller nonprofits. If you are interested in charitable organizations and you want to learn about their size and their budgets, you can go to Charity Navigator, and that should tell you that kind of thing. If you go to their websites and you search for their annual report, they are legally obligated to report to you what they make and what they net and what is used for their programs and what is used for overhead, which includes salaries. A couple final, maybe slightly more creative ideas is if you're not entirely sure, you could consider temping somewhere. Some people love that, some people don't. I once temped and it wasn't my thing. It made me so stressed out. I hated being the person who knew the least and the new kid on the block every single time I shifted to an organization. Some people find that energizing. I did not. So I learned a lot about myself in doing that. Or you can consider contracting or consulting if you have that skill set to get a sense of how you feel about doing that kind of consultation work in that sector. Because of my history, you can see why I'm a big believer in volunteering for an organization. If I hadn't donated my skills to Dog Tag, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing with them now as a team member. Took 6 years of volunteering for me, and that's not a criticism of Dog Tag. I was just enjoying what I was doing and didn't even come up with a need for the role that I play now until 4 or 5 years into my volunteering. And it was a very almost happy accident. Of course, it goes without saying that if you decide that you want to do something and you discover that you may not have the educational criteria or qualifications, then you can pursue a certificate like through the Dog Tag Fellowship Program, or get a different degree or an advanced degree, or look for other fellowship kinds of opportunities. And finally, you can find a mentor in your business area or sector of interest. And you may know about this organization called SCORE, but you can, based on your region and by your field of interest, you can connect with them, and you can find a mentor who can help you through your decision-making process. And I've checked out their organization, and they seem, I've liked what I've seen so far. I have not worked with them directly, but I've liked how they present themselves. So final takeaways for all of you. I think I've hammered this home, at least I hope. Number one is to know yourself. And number two is to learn about your options. Please don't let misperceptions rule the day. I've already said no place is perfect, but you can find a good fit. And if the first choice isn't right, I encourage you to take what you learned and pursue a better fit, whether it's in a different sector or if it's a different type of organization within that sector. And when in doubt, I really encourage you to test out your environments in the ways that we've discussed. I will stop there and ask if you have any questions, and I've given you my email address. If something strikes you afterwards, you're more than welcome to reach out. But I do want to give time for the Dog Tag team to talk a little bit as well. But if you do have any questions, just fire away, and we'll either open up, we'll take off your mute, or anything through the chat function is fine. I don't know that I see any coming through, but if I'm missing some, Francis and Ashley, just let me know.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in the chat.
Okay.
I'm good if you want to talk about business structure. That's cool. You mentioned that, and I was like, yes, let's have time for that at the end.
Yeah. What's your name?
I'm Tiffany.
Hey, Tiffany. How are
you?
Hey,
Lisa.
So glad that you were able to join. So
yeah, I'm the person who's been making all these little comments here because I really love your lighthearted approach. And I do appreciate you taking the time, because you mentioned that in government, you use constituents. Well, let me tell you a funny story. It's really quick. So I started working as a GS9 in the government, right?
Yeah.
I was in Hawaii, was military spouse. It was the time when priority placement was a thing. It's not anymore, but like back in the thing, it was like PPP was all the rage.
Yeah.
And so I landed a job at the Joint Base over there. Great opportunity. But the person that I was replacing was a military person. And it's interesting when a military person is working for the commander, because it's an interesting dynamic when a civilian who has no military experience comes in. I was calling enlisted people sir and ma'am, and I was really screwing it up. And it wasn't until a year later that the Air Force person, the colonel, was like, hey, Tiffany, did you know that you shouldn't be calling enlisted sirs? And I'm like, why the hell didn't anybody tell me this a year ago? And it's because no one takes the time to educate the stupid person. And it's like, instead of having me look like a fool, why don't you just take the time and educate me early so I don't look like a fool for a year? And so, Yeah, I guess my question is, go ahead and talk about legal entities and all of that, and B Corp, and what's the benefit of incorporating in Delaware, because here we are. Let's talk local here, and because that I don't know. So
Well,
take it away.
so those are absolutely excellent questions, and I'm don't want to cop out on you. I don't know that we have time to go into that much detail, but you actually have hit on some really important differences in the corporate world. So, for example, there are companies that are publicly held. So that means that they trade on the National Stock Exchange, and that creates a different level of expectation and pressure. There are companies that are not publicly held, so they do not have stock, so they don't have to answer to stockholders. It creates for a different kind of atmosphere. And so if a company is privately held, that doesn't mean that they can't shift to being publicly held. So it's an important question to consider or listen for, because it can change the atmosphere of the organization, maybe in a good way for you or maybe in a bad way for you. I'm really glad that you mentioned B Corps or B corporations. These are private companies, and I'm not going to give you the absolute perfect technically correct definition, that do good in the world. And they have to file to be a B corporation. And I believe with that, they get certain tax breaks, which is the motivation, but they also have to hit certain criteria and demonstrate that they are hitting those criteria in order to serve as a B Corp, get those tax benefits and other advantages, and demonstrate that they are committed to a social service, some sort of social issue. But they are not nonprofits, they are still private. The last area that I'll just touch on briefly, and I'm not hitting all of them just for the sake of time, is let's not forget the entrepreneur. You have your own business and you can incorporate as an LLC, which has certain legal considerations. You can be, excuse me, a sole proprietor. You may have staff, and you have to make sure you think through, and I would say with an attorney as well as an accountant, to decide what works well for you. And you can be, when I say sole proprietor, you can be on your own, which works really well for some people and is a very lonely existence for other people. And it also matters if you decide, if you're an LLC, what form is that going to take? Are you going to sell a product or a service? Do you want to be a consultancy? That kind of thing. And are you well suited for that? Which is a whole nother conversation, which I know Dog Tag focuses on extensively in their fellowship program. And I have a whole host of other things to say regarding that, because I was an entrepreneur two times over. But within the private sector, there is a range along the lines of what I'm describing to you. And I'm so glad that you asked that question.
I'll just jump in real quick as well. Obviously this is our mini learning lab. We can't cover all of the things, but we did actually have a session just last week with the fellows where we had somebody from the DC Bar Pro Bono Center come, and she did a whole session on the difference between like a sole proprietorship and an LLC and a B Corp. And so dived more specifically into those things. So our purpose in having Lisa here tonight was really to give you a taste of, some of those different learning labs that we host during the program. I think we have time maybe for one more question if anybody else has a question. Otherwise, we will kind of shift gears a little bit and talk just a little bit about the program.
Going once, going twice. I'm also just looking through the chats real quickly just to see.
Okay.